Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Once again, glad that you're here. Going to have a conversation with returning guest, Dr. Roger Crystal. He's joined us on the program before. He's the CEO of Opiant Pharmaceuticals, the makers of Narcan, and he's joining us to talk about the unintended medical consequences of marijuana in the mainstream. And he's also going to talk about fentanyl as a possible chemical attack agent. Welcome back to the program, Dr. Crystal. How have you been?
I've been great. How about you, Neil?
Great. Now, when you were here before, we talked about, first of all, for our listeners who may not have been here before and are a little bit unfamiliar with you, give us a bit of background about yourself, other than being CEO of Opiant.
Well, thanks for having me back on the show, Neil. Yes, so I'm from the UK originally. I'm based here in California now. Started my career as a surgeon and have been involved in this company, Opiant, one way or the other for the last 10 years or so. And we are developing medicines to treat drug overdose and addiction.
As I said, we were going to talk about some of the medical consequences, some of the unintended medical consequences of marijuana in the mainstream. Is your company involved in any type of cannabis research or study in cannabinoids or anything like that?
Well, yeah, so our company, we don't develop, not on the manufacturing side of cannabis, which is rare. A lot of companies are these days. But what we are developing is a medicine to actually treat an acute cannabinoid overdose, which isn't something people have heard of, but it happens. There's about 1 million attendances in the ER every year from people who become intoxicated from cannabinoids. And when I say cannabinoids, that's coming either from these edibles, which are 50% of the admissions are from those, and from some of these synthetic cannabinoids, illicit street drugs, some known as spice or K2. And in all these situations, patients become very sick and psychotic and need urgent care.
Now, are these edibles also made with synthetic cannabis? Or if it's synthetic, is it actually cannabis at all?
Well, the edibles are there's two categories. So there's synthetic cannabinoids. Those are, as in the name, synthetic, made in the lab, very, very potent. Edibles are coming still from regular cannabis, but the harm is because they have such large amounts of THC, and THC is the component of cannabis that gets you high, that gives you the euphoria. And the problem with edibles is that once you've swallowed them, they're in the system. There's nothing you can do about them. Whereas if you smoke or inhale marijuana, then it's somewhat self-limiting because it so rapidly gets to the brain. So individuals, if you like, typically pass out and stop inhaling.
Are the characteristics of an overdose on cannabis the same as the characteristics of an overdose on opiates?
They're quite different in that an opioid overdose is life-threatening. Patients stop breathing, and the intervention has had to be as quick as possible. In fact, even quicker now we talk about this opioid crisis being a fentanyl crisis, with fentanyl being so much more dangerous. But an acute cannabinoid overdose is less around an immediate life death, but it's the fact that patients arrive in the ER very sick, hallucinating, delirious, paranoid, and as I said, like an acute psychosis, and are not really sufficiently well to just be sent home and require hours, if not days, of care before they are safe to be sent home. And the medicine we're developing, we hope, will allow this condition to be rapidly reversed in the ER so they can be sent home sooner.
There is a drug or some type of therapy for this acute cannabis overdose. Is it similar to a Narcan type of drug?
Well, no, this drug we're developing it's not available yet. We're working on it, but it will be available if it gets approved by the FDA. And it works by blocking what's called cannabinoid receptors in the brain, so that THC from edibles or the synthetic cannabinoid compounds can't get to that part of the brain, and therefore, if it's blocking activity, that's how we hope that this will reverse this type of an overdose. So quite different to how naloxone or other opioid antagonists work.
Are you very optimistic about the approval by the FDA, as was Narcan?
Well, we're a bit earlier along than where we were with Narcan. So in a sense, it would be too far-fetched for me to say absolutely. However, there's some very, yeah.
Now, we were talking before about this opioid crisis. We discussed how it kind of morphed into a fentanyl crisis, and we also talked when you were here before about the bulk of this fentanyl that is killing people is coming from outside the United States, whereas the fentanyl here in the United States is obviously FDA approved, but that's neither basically here nor there when a crisis is a crisis. I mentioned that we were going to discuss how fentanyl has the potential to be used as a chemical warfare agent. Let's talk first about the potency of fentanyl.
So fentanyl, yes, it's an opioid, but it's 50 times stronger than heroin, and it gets much more rapidly into the blood and actually the brain. And for that reason, it's so rapid acting that it's a lot more dangerous. And combined with its longer action, say its half-life is 7 to 8 hours, whereas heroin has a half-life of 1 to 2 hours. It really makes it a lot more dangerous a compound. And it, for that reason, takes a much, much smaller amount of fentanyl to cause a significant amount of harm.
Now, is it available in many different forms, as are opioids?
Well, the prescription-based fentanyl is very tightly controlled in this country. So, for example, anesthesiologists use it. Sometimes, for example, it's part of a spinal administration for an epidural. But in those situations, that's not really what people are either getting their hands on or getting addicted to. And that the fentanyl is getting in this country that's caused this opioid crisis, or now the main driver, and that's why we say it is a fentanyl crisis. That fentanyl is coming from China as more like powder form. So just being sent in the mail and in envelopes, etc. That's the main form it arrives in. Once it gets into the hands of the wrong people inhale it, smoke it, inject it, all sorts.
You know, it's reminiscent of many years ago, the mail attacks on some politicians in the United States, some celebrities in the United States, of different compounds being delivered through the mail. Is that form of fentanyl that we're talking about, is that what lends it the possibility to be used as say a weaponized form, or in a weaponized way?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways, yes, because the general way it's being, when I say being used, I'll give the example of when it was used, and that might help yourself and your listeners understand what the concern is. In the early 2000s, there was a attack on a Russian opera house whereby some Chechnyan rebels took over this opera house and took hostages. And the Russians, to try and deal with the situation, decided to gas the opera house. I think the hope was at least to sedate everyone inside so they could go in and deal with the issue. The chemical they used was fentanyl, and it resulted in the deaths of 119 people.
Wow. So
the prior incident in itself alone is a sufficient validation of the use of fentanyl. And we combine that with the concern that increasingly large amounts of fentanyl are being discovered on U.S. soil. And obviously we only become aware of what for example, the Border Control or the DEA are able to seize. We don't know what gets through. But as an example, just earlier this year, there was 50 kilograms, so about 100 pounds or so of fentanyl that was seized actually at the Mexican border, which is unusual because most of it is coming from China. And it's estimated that amount of fentanyl could kill over 50 million people. So we have a situation of a prior use of fentanyl in a chemical attack with much, much more fentanyl arriving on U.S. soil. So that's the concern. And for that reason, this medicine we're working on, nasal nalmefene, we think is potentially better suited to address a fentanyl overdose because it's more potent. It's more potent than naloxone, and nalmefene also acts for longer than naloxone. So the idea, if we can get this medication approved, is that it could also be stockpiled in hotspot areas which might be considered vulnerable for a fentanyl chemical attack.
So you've got a patient, your emergency medical team has been called in. You've got a patient that's overdosed on your regular opiate, and one dose is sufficient. If they're overdosing on fentanyl or are on fentanyl and you want to counteract the effects, is it being stronger than Narcan? Does it take one dose, or are there more doses involved because of the strength of the fentanyl?
Well, when we consider the current situation in general, so first thing to say is we don't know. If someone's just lying unresponsive, first of all, in this country, if a young male, 50 or younger, unresponsive, you have to assume it's an opiate overdose these days over and above anything else that cause someone to be unresponsive. So then one assumes, you have to assume it is fentanyl because the most recent data set in 2017, 55% of opiate overdose deaths contained fentanyl. So statistically, what you're presented in front of you is a fentanyl overdose unless proven otherwise. So in terms of, well, does naloxone work and how much is required from patient to patient? It's hard to answer that because there's so little data to know how long the patient's been down for. Perhaps different people have a different reserve. For example, if it's a younger, healthy adult, otherwise, then they might be able to be down for longer because they've got more backup in the system, so to speak. And it's not that, again, the naloxone does not work, but the concern and the issue is that increasingly larger amounts of naloxone are required to reverse fentanyl overdoses in the first instance, than perhaps a heroin overdose in the past. And accompanied with that, we have a situation whereby what we describe as the risk of re-narcotization. What does that mean? That is because fentanyl is so much longer acting than naloxone. Once the naloxone wears off, the fentanyl, if you like, can come back to bite. So someone might have been initially resuscitated, then falls back into an overdose. And that's very unfortunate. And especially in this country where a lot of our land mass and a lot of our population are in fact in more remote rural areas, one could potentially fall back into an overdose before even making it to the ER department.
Well, Roger, I'd love to talk with you more, and maybe we can get you back again. Where can we go online and talk about, get more information about opiate pharmaceuticals?
So we have our website, which is www.opiant.com, OPIANT.com. And we're also on Twitter at @opiant_pharma.
Great. Roger, thanks so much for joining us again here on Health Professional Radio. Hoping to talk with you again soon.
Thank you for speaking with me, Neil. Enjoy your day. Bye.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au.
Thank you for listening to Health Professional Radio. We're very proud to be an independent broadcaster providing our content free of charge to you, the listener. One of the ways that we're able to remain free and independent is by having people like you become patrons. You can support Health Professional Radio simply by visiting hpr.fm and clicking the button that says Become a Patron. Your patronage of even just $1 a month lets us know that you're there, which in turn makes us more valuable to advertisers. And, of course, if you're able to afford more, then we would certainly appreciate the support. My name is Toby Longhurst from Health Professional Radio. Please visit hpr.fm, click the Become a Patron button, and support us if you can.